The morning light filtered through the narrow windows of Denver County Correctional Facility, casting long shadows across the concrete corridors that had witnessed countless stories of desperation and hope. It was March 15th, 1985, and the city beyond these walls was awakening to another day of promise and possibility. Inside, however, time moved differently, measured not by the rising sun, but by the rhythmic counting of heads, the turning of keys, and the endless echo of footsteps on cold floors. Officer Margaret Thornfield had been walking these halls for 7 years, long enough to recognize the subtle sounds that meant trouble before it announced itself. She possessed that rare intuition that comes only from years of experience, an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was wrong in the carefully orchestrated symphony of prison life. On this particular morning, as she approached Cell Block 7 with her clipboard and practiced routine, she had no idea that she was about to stumble upon a mystery that would haunt her for the rest of her career. The morning count was sacred in the world of corrections, a ritual that began precisely at 6:30 and could not be compromised. Each prisoner had to be accounted for, each cell checked, each face verified against the roster that represented the delicate balance between security and humanity. Margaret had performed this count thousands of times, moving with the mechanical precision that comes from repetition, but also with the careful attention that keeps everyone safe. Cell 712 had been home to Nathaniel Westbrook for the past 14 months. He was what the staff quietly referred to as a model prisoner, someone who caused no trouble, kept his cell clean, and seemed genuinely committed to using his time behind bars for reflection and change. At 43 years old, Nathaniel had been serving a 5-year sentence for financial fraud, a white-collar crime that had landed him in a facility far removed from the life of comfort and respectability he had once known. The story of how Nathaniel Westbrook came to be in that cell began 2 years earlier, when his carefully constructed world of investment consulting and financial planning began to unravel. He had been living in the affluent neighborhood of Cherry Hills, in a house that spoke of success and stability, with a wife named Catherine and 2 teenage children who attended private school and dreamed of college. To his neighbors and clients, Nathaniel represented everything the American dream promised: hard work, rewarded with prosperity, intelligence channeled into legitimate success, and a family that seemed blessed with happiness. But behind the facade of suburban perfection, Nathaniel had been struggling with demons that few people could have imagined. The pressure to maintain his lifestyle, combined with some poor investment decisions and a gambling problem he had kept hidden from everyone, had led him down a path of increasingly desperate choices. What began as borrowing from one client to pay another quickly spiraled into a complex web of deception that involved forged documents, fictional investment opportunities, and promises that he knew he could never keep. When the House of Cards finally collapsed in the summer of 1983, the investigation revealed that Nathaniel had defrauded 17 clients out of nearly $500,000. These were not faceless corporations or wealthy individuals who could absorb the loss, but ordinary people who had trusted him with their retirement savings, their children's college funds, and their dreams of financial security. The weight of what he had done seemed to crush him during the trial, and those who knew him said he aged 10 years in the span of a few months. Catherine had stood by him initially, believing his promises that he would make everything right, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding that would be resolved. But as the evidence mounted and the reality of his crimes became undeniable, she made the painful decision to file for divorce. She took the children and moved to her sister's house in Portland, leaving Nathaniel to face the consequences of his actions alone. The last time she had visited him in prison was 6 months after his sentencing, and even then, the conversation had been strained and formal, filled with the kind of careful politeness that marks the end of love. In prison, Nathaniel had found an unexpected peace, Away from the pressures and temptations that had led to his downfall, he spent his days in the library, reading voraciously and working on a book about financial ethics that he hoped might someday help others avoid his mistakes. He had lost weight, grown a beard that made him look older, but somehow wiser, and developed a reputation among both inmates and staff as someone who could be trusted with responsibility and treated with respect. His cellmate was a young man named Derek Pemberton, serving time for burglary, who had initially been suspicious of this educated middle-class newcomer. But over the months, they had developed an unlikely friendship based on mutual respect and shared experiences of regret. Derek often said that Nathaniel had taught him more about life in 14 months than he had learned in his previous 25 years. And Nathaniel seemed to find purpose in mentoring someone who reminded him of his own son. The prison itself was a fortress of routine and regulation, a place where every moment was accounted for and every movement monitored. Built in 1972, it housed just over 800 inmates in 4 separate blocks, each designed with security and efficiency in mind. The cells were small but adequate, measuring 8 feet by 10 feet, with concrete walls, steel doors, and narrow windows that offered a limited view of the sky. Each door was equipped with 2 locks, a standard mechanism operated by key, and an electronic system that could only be controlled from the main security station. Cell 712 was located on the 2nd tier of the newest block, accessible only through a series of secured doors and checkpoints that required multiple staff members to navigate. The corridor was monitored by cameras positioned at strategic intervals, and guards walked regular patrols throughout the day and night. It was, by any reasonable measure, impossible to leave without authorization, and equally impossible for someone to enter without being detected. On the evening of March 14th, Nathaniel had followed his usual routine with the predictability that had become his signature in prison. He attended the evening meal at 5:30, sitting with Derek and a small group of other inmates who had formed their own informal support network. The conversation was light, focused on a book they were reading together about American history, and several witnesses later recalled that Nathaniel seemed relaxed and even optimistic about a letter he had received from his daughter. After dinner, he spent an hour in the recreation area, playing chess with an older inmate named Harold Fitzpatrick, who was nearing the end of a long sentence and had become something of a father figure to Nathaniel. Harold later told investigators that Nathaniel had been in good spirits, talking about his plans for when he was released and his hope that he might eventually rebuild his relationship with his children. There had been no indication of depression, anxiety, or any other emotional distress that might have motivated desperate action. The 8 o'clock count found Nathaniel in his cell, reading a biography of Abraham Lincoln and preparing for sleep. Officer Janet Blackwood, who conducted the count that evening, remembered him clearly because he had asked her to pass along a message to the librarian about a book he wanted to reserve. She had spoken with him through the cell door, noting that he seemed alert and engaged, showing no signs of illness or distress. Derek was also in the cell, working on a letter to his mother, and both men were accounted for and secured for the night. The cell door was locked according to standard procedure at 8:15, with both the mechanical and electronic systems engaged. The lock was tested by Officer Blackwood, who found it secure and functioning properly. The evening patrol checks at 10 o'clock and midnight found both inmates in their bunks, apparently sleeping peacefully. The night passed without incident, with no alarms, no unusual sounds, and no disruptions to the careful rhythm of institutional life. At 6:30 sharp on the morning of March 15th, Officer Margaret Thornfield began her count at the far end of the corridor, working methodically toward cell 712. She had completed 43 cells without incident, finding each prisoner accounted for and beginning their morning routines. The conversations were brief and professional, the kind of exchanges that had become second nature after years of practice. When she reached cell 712 and peered through the small window in the steel door, Margaret initially saw exactly what she expected to see. Derek Pemberton was sitting on the edge of his bunk, pulling on his shoes and preparing for breakfast. The cell appeared normal in every way, tidy and organized according to the standards that both inmates maintained. But as her eyes swept the small space, Margaret felt a cold wave of confusion wash over her. Nathaniel Westbrook was nowhere to be seen. Margaret checked her roster, thinking perhaps she had made an error, but the documentation clearly showed that both inmates should be in cell 712. She called out to Derek, asking about his cellmate, and the young man looked up with an expression of bewilderment that matched her own. Derek explained that he had awakened to find Nathaniel's bunk empty and unmade, with no sign of where he might have gone or when he might have left. The cell door was still locked, both systems functioning perfectly. The electronic log showed no record of the door being opened since the previous evening. The cameras in the corridor had detected no movement during the night hours. The windows were too narrow for a person to pass through, and even if they had been larger, they were secured with bars and opened onto a courtyard that was continuously monitored. Margaret immediately called for backup and began the procedures that would transform a routine morning count into the beginning of an investigation that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the prison security systems. Within minutes, the cell block was sealed, alarms were sounding throughout the facility, and every available staff member was being summoned to account for what appeared to be impossible. As word of the disappearance spread through the prison, inmates and staff members alike found themselves grappling with questions that had no ready answers. How does a man simply vanish from a locked cell? Where could he have gone in a facility designed to prevent exactly this kind of occurrence? And perhaps most troubling of all, if Nathaniel Westbrook could disappear without a trace, what did that say about the security that everyone had taken for granted? The search began immediately, with teams of officers combing every inch of the facility, from the kitchen storage areas to the maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the main building. Dogs were brought in to track any scent trail that might lead to answers, and the state police were notified to begin monitoring roads and transportation hubs throughout the region. But as the hours passed, with no sign of the missing prisoner, it became clear that this was not a typical escape that could be explained by conventional means. The prison's alarm system continued its relentless wailing as Warden Charles Morrison arrived at the facility, his usual composed demeanor shaken by the impossible report he had received over the phone. Morrison had run Denver County Correctional for 12 years, and in all that time, he had never faced a situation that so fundamentally challenged the basic principles of institutional security. As he strode through the corridors toward cell block 7, his mind raced through possible explanations, each one more troubling than the last. The initial search had expanded beyond the cell block to encompass the entire facility. Officer Margaret Thornfield found herself at the center of a rapidly growing investigation, her years of experience suddenly feeling inadequate in the face of such an unprecedented mystery. She walked investigators through her morning routine step by step, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Every detail was scrutinized, every procedure questioned, as if the simple act of retelling the story might reveal some overlooked clue. Derek Pemberton, Nathaniel's cellmate, became the focus of intense questioning. The young man sat in the interview room, his hands trembling slightly as he repeated his story for the 4th time that morning. He had gone to sleep around 10:30 the previous evening, he explained, and Nathaniel had been reading in the lower bunk as he always did. During the night, Derek had awakened once to use the small toilet in their cell, and he was certain that Nathaniel had been there, breathing quietly in his sleep. When morning came and Derek opened his eyes, the bunk was empty, the blankets thrown back as if someone had simply gotten up and walked away. The physical evidence, or lack thereof, painted an equally puzzling picture. The cell showed no signs of struggle, no hidden passages, no clever modifications that might have facilitated an escape. Nathaniel's personal belongings remained exactly as they had been, including the biography of Lincoln that lay open on his pillow, a bookmark carefully placed at page 237. His prison-issued clothing was accounted for, hanging in the small closet area, and even his toothbrush remained in its designated spot. The electronic security logs were examined by technicians who arrived from the state correctional headquarters, their sophisticated equipment designed to detect any anomalies in the system. The data showed exactly what it should have shown. The cell door had been secured at 8:15 the previous evening and had remained locked throughout the night. The magnetic sensors, motion detectors and backup systems all confirmed that the door had not been opened. Yet somehow, impossibly, Nathaniel Westbrook was gone. As news of the disappearance spread beyond the prison walls, it sent shockwaves through the community that extended far beyond the immediate concern for public safety. Catherine Westbrook, now Catherine Mitchell after remarrying, received the phone call at her Portland home just after noon. She listened in stunned silence as officials explained the situation, her mind struggling to process the implications of what she was hearing. Despite their divorce and the painful circumstances that had led to it, she found herself overwhelmed by a complex mixture of worry, confusion, and an unexpected surge of old emotions she thought she had buried. Their children, now 17 and 15, reacted with the kind of teenage bewilderment that comes from having their understanding of reality suddenly challenged. Sarah, the older of the two, had maintained sporadic correspondence with her father during his imprisonment, driven by a mixture of love and duty that she couldn't quite articulate. Her younger brother Michael had been more resistant to contact, his anger at his father's crimes still burning bright after 2 years. But faced with his father's mysterious disappearance, Michael found himself grappling with fears he hadn't expected to feel. The investigation expanded rapidly, drawing resources from multiple law enforcement agencies as the hours passed without answers. Detective Lieutenant Patricia Hayes of the Denver Police Department took charge of the external investigation, coordinating with federal authorities who were brought in due to the potential interstate implications of the case. Hayes was a 30-year veteran with a reputation for methodical thoroughness, but even she admitted privately that she had never encountered anything quite like this. The search effort encompassed an ever-widening circle around the prison, with helicopters scanning the surrounding countryside and roadblocks established at key intersections. Nathaniel's photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the region, and his description was broadcast on local news stations. The story captured public attention in a way that surprised everyone involved, tapping into a fascination with mysteries that seemed to defy logical explanation. Harold Fitzpatrick, the elderly inmate who had played chess with Nathaniel on that final evening, found himself questioned repeatedly about their last conversation. He told investigators that Nathaniel had seemed genuinely hopeful about the future, discussing his plans to write letters of apology to all of his victims once he was released. Harold mentioned that Nathaniel had spoken about wanting to work with financial literacy programs, using his experience and expertise to help people avoid the kinds of mistakes that had led to his own downfall. There had been no indication of despair, no hint that he was contemplating any kind of desperate action. The prison staff faced intense scrutiny as investigators sought to understand how such a breach of security could have occurred. Every guard who had been on duty during the previous 24 hours was interviewed, their movements tracked and verified. Officer Janet Blackwood, who had conducted the evening count, found herself under particular pressure to recall every detail of her interaction with Nathaniel. She remembered his request about the library book, his apparent good mood, and the routine nature of their brief conversation. Nothing had seemed unusual or worthy of special attention. Maintenance records were examined going back months, as investigators looked for any evidence of unauthorized modifications to the cell or the surrounding infrastructure. The prison's ventilation system was mapped and inspected, every duct and crawl space explored by teams of investigators. The electrical systems were analyzed for signs of tampering, and even the plumbing was examined for possible escape routes. The facility's construction blueprints were compared against the actual layout, searching for discrepancies that might reveal hidden passages or forgotten spaces. As days turned into weeks, the initial urgency of the search began to give way to a more methodical, long-term investigation. The FBI became involved, bringing sophisticated analytical resources to bear on what had become a case of national interest. Special Agent Robert Chen, assigned to lead the federal investigation, approached the mystery with the kind of systematic methodology that had made him successful in complex fraud cases. He theorized that if Nathaniel had indeed escaped, it would have required extensive planning, inside assistance, and resources that seemed inconsistent with his known circumstances. The investigation revealed disturbing irregularities in the prison's security procedures, though none that seemed to directly explain Nathaniel's disappearance. Several staff members were found to have occasionally bypassed certain protocols, and the electronic monitoring systems had experienced brief malfunctions that had been deemed insignificant at the time. Officer Thomas Bradley, who worked the overnight shift, admitted under questioning that he sometimes shortened his patrol routes when the facility seemed quiet, though he insisted he had followed proper procedures on the night in question. More troubling was the discovery that the prison's visitor logs showed several inconsistencies in recent months, with sign-in times that didn't match security camera timestamps and visitor passes that had been issued without proper verification. While none of these irregularities could be directly linked to Nathaniel's case, they painted a picture of an institution where security had become somewhat lax through complacency and routine. Catherine found herself drawn back into her former husband's story in ways she hadn't anticipated. The investigators contacted her repeatedly, seeking insights into his personality, his capabilities, and his possible motivations. She struggled to reconcile the man she had known with the possibility that he might have orchestrated such an elaborate escape. The Nathaniel she remembered was intelligent and resourceful, but he was also someone who faced problems directly rather than running from them. His decision to plead guilty to the fraud charges, despite his lawyer's advice to fight them, had been consistent with his desire to accept responsibility for his actions. The media attention surrounding the case brought renewed focus to Nathaniel's original crimes, and several of his victims found themselves thrust back into the spotlight. Eleanor Patterson, a retired teacher who had lost her life savings to Nathaniel's fraudulent investment scheme, spoke to reporters about her mixed feelings regarding his disappearance. She admitted that part of her hoped he had escaped, not because she forgave him, but because the alternative explanations seemed somehow worse. The idea that someone could simply vanish from existence troubled her in ways that went beyond her personal grievances. 6 months after the disappearance, the active search was officially scaled back, though the case remained open and investigators continued to follow up on leads. Reported sightings came in from across the country, each one investigated and ultimately dismissed. A man matching Nathaniel's description was spotted working at a construction site in Phoenix, but fingerprint analysis proved it was someone else entirely. Security cameras at a bus station in Kansas City captured footage of a figure who bore a resemblance to the missing prisoner, but closer examination revealed significant physical differences. The prison implemented numerous security upgrades in response to the investigation's findings, installing additional cameras, upgrading the electronic monitoring systems, and establishing new protocols for staff verification. Warden Morrison, facing criticism from state officials and the media, announced his early retirement, citing the stress of the situation and his desire to spend more time with his family. His replacement, Warden Sandra Coleman, arrived with a mandate to restore public confidence in the facility's security. Derek Pemberton completed his sentence and was released 2 years after his cellmate's disappearance. He had become something of a minor celebrity among other inmates, the man who had slept 3 feet away from one of the most mysterious disappearances in modern correctional history. Upon his release, Derek maintained that he had no knowledge of how Nathaniel had vanished, but he also expressed certainty that his former cellmate was still alive somewhere. The bond they had formed during their time together had convinced Derek that Nathaniel was not the type of person to give up on life, regardless of his circumstances. As the years passed, the case became part of local folklore, the kind of story that people told at dinner parties and discussed in online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries. The prison staff who had been on duty that night found themselves forever linked to the case, their careers defined by their proximity to the impossible. Margaret Thornfield, the officer who had first discovered the empty cell, eventually transferred to a different facility, but she never stopped thinking about that morning when her routine count had revealed something that challenged everything she thought she understood about her job. Detective Hayes retired 5 years after the disappearance, the Westbrook case remaining one of the few failures that haunted her otherwise successful career. She had pursued every lead, interviewed every possible witness, and analyzed every piece of evidence with the thoroughness that had made her reputation. Yet, despite her efforts, she had never found a satisfactory explanation for how a man could simply vanish from a locked cell in a maximum security facility. The case files, eventually numbering in the thousands of pages, were stored in boxes that gathered dust in various government offices. Occasionally, new investigators would review the materials, hoping that fresh eyes might spot something that had been overlooked. Each review reached the same conclusion. There was no evidence that Nathaniel Westbrook had died in his cell, no evidence that he had escaped, and no evidence that explained what had become of him. Catherine, now in her 60s and living a quiet life in a Portland suburb, still received occasional phone calls from investigators following up on new leads or reviewing old evidence. Her children had grown and started families of their own, carrying with them the unusual distinction of having a father who had simply disappeared from existence. Sarah had become a social worker, drawn perhaps by her father's story to a profession focused on helping people navigate difficult circumstances. Michael had become an accountant, choosing a career path that seemed to represent everything his father's professional life should have been. Nathaniel's case influenced changes in correctional facilities across the state and beyond, as administrators sought to prevent similar incidents through improved technology and procedures. The idea that someone could vanish without explanation was so troubling to the fundamental concepts of institutional security that it prompted widespread reforms in how prisons monitored their populations. In the digital age, the mystery found new life on internet platforms where amateur investigators analyzed every detail of the case, proposing theories that ranged from the plausible to the fantastical. Some suggested that Nathaniel had discovered a previously unknown weakness in the prison's design and had exploited it with careful planning. Others proposed more elaborate scenarios involving corrupt guards, underground networks, or even supernatural explanations that the rational mind rejected but could not entirely dismiss. 23 years after Nathaniel Westbrook's disappearance, the Denver County Correctional Facility underwent a major renovation project designed to modernize its aging infrastructure and expand its capacity. The construction crew, working to upgrade the electrical systems throughout the oldest section of the facility, made a discovery that would reignite interest in one of Colorado's most enduring mysteries. Hidden behind a false wall in a maintenance area that had been sealed off decades earlier, workers found a small space that contained items that clearly didn't belong there. Among the dusty remnants of old construction materials, they discovered a prison-issued blanket, a wooden chess piece that matched the set from the facility's recreation room. and most significantly, a handwritten letter that bore the unmistakable signature of Nathaniel Westbrook. The letter, dated 3 days after his disappearance and addressed to his daughter Sarah, would prove to be the first concrete evidence in over 2 decades that might finally provide answers to questions that had puzzled investigators, haunted those who knew him, and captured the imagination of anyone who had ever wondered how a man could simply vanish from a locked room, leaving behind only the echo of an impossible mystery. The letter changed everything, yet answered nothing in the way anyone had expected. Sarah Westbrook Chen, now a woman of 40 with children of her own, stood in the conference room of the Denver County District Attorney's office, holding the yellowed piece of paper that bore her father's familiar handwriting. 23 years had passed since that impossible morning when Nathaniel Westbrook had vanished from his locked cell, and now, at last, there was evidence that he had indeed survived those first few days after his disappearance. The letter was brief, written in the careful script that Sarah remembered from birthday cards and homework help during her childhood. It spoke of love, regret, and a decision that he knew would cause more pain, but felt necessary for reasons he couldn't fully explain. Most significantly, it contained specific details about events that had occurred after his disappearance, proving conclusively that he had somehow left the prison alive and had remained free, at least for a time. Detective Maria Santos, who had inherited the cold case when she joined the department 5 years earlier, watched Sarah's face as she read her father's final words. Santos had spent countless hours reviewing the old files, fascinated by the mystery, and determined to bring closure to one of the most perplexing cases in Colorado law enforcement history. The discovery of the letter had vindicated her belief that Nathaniel's disappearance had been a carefully planned escape rather than something more sinister. The investigation that followed the letter's discovery moved with the efficiency that modern forensic science made possible. DNA analysis confirmed that Nathaniel had indeed been in the hidden space behind the maintenance area, and carbon dating of other materials found there suggested he had spent several days in that cramped hiding place. The chess piece, carved with initials that matched Harold Fitzpatrick's prison identification number, provided a crucial link to how the escape had been orchestrated. Harold, now 87 years old and living in a retirement facility outside Denver, had been reluctant to speak with investigators when they approached him. His health was failing, his memory inconsistent, but when shown the chess piece, something in his eyes shifted. After nearly a quarter-century of silence, he finally began to tell the truth about what had happened in March of 1985. The escape had been Harold's idea, born from a combination of genuine affection for Nathaniel and his own desire to strike back at a system that had consumed most of his adult life. As an inmate who had spent decades in various correctional facilities, Harold had accumulated knowledge about institutional weaknesses that few people possessed. He had discovered the sealed maintenance area during his work assignment in the prison's electrical shop and had spent months carefully preparing it as a hiding place. The plan had required precise timing and the cooperation of several people, both inside and outside the prison walls. Officer Thomas Bradley, the guard who had admitted to occasionally shortening his patrol routes, had been more deeply involved than anyone had suspected. Bradley's gambling debts had made him vulnerable to outside pressure, and Harold had somehow learned about this weakness and exploited it. On the night of March 14th, Bradley had unlocked Nathaniel's cell during his midnight patrol, allowing him to slip out and make his way to the prepared hiding place. The electronic systems had been briefly disabled through a technique that Harold had learned from another inmate years earlier, creating a window of opportunity that lasted less than 10 minutes. Derek had been given a mild sedative in his evening meal, ensuring that he would sleep deeply and remember nothing of his cellmate's departure. For 5 days, Nathaniel had remained hidden in the cramped space behind the false wall, surviving on food and water that Harold had stockpiled there over several weeks. The letter to Sarah had been written during those days of hiding, as he wrestled with the implications of what he was doing and tried to find words to explain the unexplainable. Harold's plan had always included an exit strategy, involving people from his own past who owed him favors or who could be convinced to help for various reasons. On the 5th night after the disappearance, Nathaniel had been smuggled out of the prison in a laundry truck driven by Bradley, who had been promised enough money to pay off his gambling debts and start fresh in another state. But as Detective Santos discovered through patient investigation, the escape had not proceeded according to plan beyond that point. The outside contacts that Harold had counted on proved unreliable, and Nathaniel found himself alone in a world that had moved on without him. With no identification, no resources, and a face that had been broadcast on news stations across the region, he was forced to rely on the kindness of strangers and his own resourcefulness. The trail of Nathaniel's life after the escape emerged slowly, pieced together through painstaking detective work and advances in technology that hadn't existed during the original investigation. Financial records, cross-referenced with facial recognition software applied to old security footage, revealed a pattern of movement that stretched across multiple states over several years. He had worked construction jobs under false names, always careful to avoid situations that required extensive documentation. In Nevada, he had spent 18 months helping to build low-income housing, sending anonymous donations to several of his former victims through a complex system of money transfers that took investigators months to trace. In Oregon, just 200 miles from where his former wife was building her new life, he had worked in a homeless shelter, using his education and natural empathy to counsel people who had lost everything. The most significant discovery came from a small town in Montana, where church records from the mid-1990s indicated that a man matching Nathaniel's description had spent his final years helping to establish a financial literacy program for rural communities. He'd used the name Nathan Webb, and though he had been careful to maintain his anonymity, several people remembered him as someone who possessed unusual expertise in financial matters and seemed driven by a deep sense of responsibility toward others. Nathan Webb had died in a car accident in the winter of 1997, 12 years after his disappearance from prison. He had been alone in the vehicle, driving through a mountain pass during a snowstorm while returning from a financial counseling session with a family facing foreclosure. The local authorities had been unable to identify him at the time, and he had been buried in an unmarked grave in the town's small cemetery. The news of her father's death, delivered more than 2 decades after the fact, hit Sarah with an unexpected force. She had spent years wondering whether he was alive somewhere, whether he ever thought about the family he had left behind, whether he regretted the choices that had torn their lives apart. Learning that he had died alone, far from anyone who knew his real name or his story, filled her with a grief that felt both fresh and ancient. Catherine, now 71 and dealing with her own health challenges, received the news with a composure that surprised everyone, including herself. The years had softened her anger and replaced it with a complex understanding of the man she had once loved. She told investigators that she felt a strange sense of relief, knowing that Nathaniel's story had finally reached its conclusion, that the wondering and uncertainty could finally come to an end. Michael's reaction was more complicated. As a successful accountant with a reputation built on integrity and transparency, he had spent his entire professional life trying to be everything his father had not been. The revelation that Nathaniel had spent his final years trying to help others avoid financial mistakes felt like both a vindication and a challenge to the narrative Michael had constructed about their relationship. The legal implications of the discoveries were complex and largely symbolic. Officer Bradley had died in a car accident in Nevada in 1991, taking many secrets to his grave. Harold's advanced age and deteriorating health made prosecution unlikely, and his cooperation with investigators was seen as a form of confession that brought its own kind of justice. The statute of limitations had expired on many of the charges that might have applied to the escape itself. More significant were the emotional and spiritual reckonings that the revelations made possible. Sarah made the journey to Montana to see the place where her father had died and where he had spent his final years. The people she met there remembered Nathan Webb as a quiet, kind man who had seemed to carry a great sadness, but who channeled it into helping others. The financial literacy program he had helped establish was still operating, having assisted hundreds of families over the years. At the small cemetery where her father was buried, Sarah finally had the conversation she had been waiting 23 years to have. Standing beside the simple headstone that the town had eventually provided for their unknown resident, she spoke about forgiveness, about understanding, and about the ways that people can change, even when the world refuses to let them forget their mistakes. The discovery of Nathaniel's fate also brought an unexpected reunion between Sarah and Derek Pemberton, her father's former cellmate, who had built a successful career as a substance abuse counselor after his release from prison. Derek had often spoken about Nathaniel in his own counseling work, using their friendship as an example of how people from vastly different backgrounds could find common ground and mutual support. Learning the truth about the escape felt like losing his friend all over again, but it also validated his belief that Nathaniel had been genuinely committed to becoming a better person. Harold Fitzpatrick's final interview with investigators took place in the quiet sunroom of his care facility, where he sat surrounded by photographs of the family members who visited him regularly. His voice was weak, but his eyes were clear as he explained his motivations for orchestrating the escape. He had seen in Nathaniel someone who reminded him of his own younger self, before years of poor choices had led to a lifetime of incarceration. Helping Nathaniel escape had been Harold's way of giving someone else the second chance he had never been able to claim for himself. The chess piece that had been found with the letter became a symbol of the unlikely friendship between the two men. Harold explained that he had carved it during his final weeks in prison, intending it as a gift for Nathaniel to remember their games by. That it had ended up in the hiding place suggested that Nathaniel had understood its significance and had kept it with him during those terrifying days when he waited for his chance at freedom. As the investigation concluded, Detective Santos found herself reflecting on the nature of justice and redemption. The case had consumed 2 years of her professional life and had challenged her understanding of what it meant to serve and protect. Nathaniel Westbrook had been a criminal who had hurt innocent people, but he had also been a human being capable of growth and change. His escape had been illegal, but his efforts to make amends suggested a genuine transformation that prison might never have facilitated. The final report on the Westbrook case filled more than 300 pages and became required reading at police academies across the region. It detailed not just the mechanics of the escape, but also the systemic failures that had made it possible and the human stories that gave the mystery its enduring power. The report concluded that while Nathaniel Westbrook had evaded justice in the traditional sense, he had ultimately imposed upon himself a punishment more severe than any court might have prescribed. Sarah arranged for her father's remains to be moved from the unmarked grave in Montana to a cemetery in Denver, where they could be properly honored and where family members could visit. The headstone she chose bore his real name, along with a simple inscription that captured what she had learned about his final years. He found his way home by helping others find theirs. The dedication service was attended by an unlikely group of people whose lives had been touched by Nathaniel's story. Catherine came, along with Michael and his children, who were meeting their grandfather for the first time in any meaningful way. Derek was there, as were several of the people from Montana who had known Nathan Webb. Even Eleanor Patterson, the retired teacher who had lost her savings to Nathaniel's fraud, made the journey from her assisted living facility to pay her respects. Eleanor's presence at the service surprised everyone, including herself. She had spent years hating Nathaniel Westbrook for what he had taken from her, but learning about his efforts to help others had gradually transformed her anger into something resembling understanding. She told Sarah that she had come not to forgive her father, but to acknowledge that people were more complicated than their worst actions, and that redemption could take forms that no one anticipated. The money that Nathaniel had anonymously sent to his victims over the years had never been enough to fully compensate for their losses, but the investigators' report had documented his efforts to make whatever amends were possible given his circumstances. Several of his former clients found some measure of closure in knowing that he had not simply disappeared without conscience, that their losses had weighed on him throughout his years of exile. In the months following the resolution of the case, Sarah began work on a book about her father's life and disappearance. The project started as a way of processing her own complicated emotions about the revelations, but it evolved into something larger, an exploration of how families survive betrayal, how communities heal from crime, and how redemption can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. The book, when it was published 3 years later, became a bestseller that resonated with readers who had their own experiences with family shame, criminal justice, and the long journey toward forgiveness. Sarah donated a portion of the proceeds to financial literacy programs like the one her father had helped establish, creating a foundation that would continue his work of helping people avoid the mistakes that had destroyed his own family. Detective Santos was promoted to lieutenant partly based on her work on the Westbrook case, but she found that the experience had changed her approach to law enforcement in fundamental ways. She began advocating for restorative justice programs that emphasized healing and accountability over purely punitive measures, arguing that the most serious crimes often required the most creative approaches to achieving true justice. The Denver County Correctional Facility underwent significant reforms in the wake of the case's resolution, implementing new security measures and establishing programs designed to help inmates maintain family connections and prepare for successful reintegration into society. Warden Coleman, who had implemented many of these changes, often spoke about the Westbrook case as a reminder that the ultimate goal of corrections should be to reduce future crime, not simply to punish past behavior. Harold Fitzpatrick passed away peacefully 6 months after his final interview with investigators, having lived long enough to see the truth finally emerge about the escape he had orchestrated. His family, who had known nothing about his role in the disappearance, struggled to reconcile the grandfather they loved with the man who had helped a convicted felon escape from prison. In time, they came to understand that Harold's actions, while illegal, had been motivated by compassion for someone he saw as deserving of a second chance. The story of Nathaniel Westbrook's disappearance and the eventual discovery of his fate became part of the folklore of Colorado law enforcement, told and retold in training sessions and conference presentations. But beyond its value as a case study in investigation techniques or security procedures, it served as a reminder that every criminal case involves human beings capable of both terrible mistakes and extraordinary growth. Years after the case was officially closed, Sarah would sometimes drive past the site where the old Denver County Correctional Facility had stood before its demolition and replacement with a more modern facility. She would think about that impossible morning when her father had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and grief. The truth, when it finally emerged, had been both simpler and more complex than anyone had imagined. There had been no supernatural explanation, no elaborate conspiracy, just a frightened man accepting help from an unlikely friend and then spending the rest of his life trying to earn the redemption that the legal system had been unable to provide. The chess piece that Harold had carved now sat on Sarah's mantelpiece, a tangible connection to a friendship that had changed multiple lives in ways that none of the participants could have foreseen. Sometimes her own children would ask about it, and she would tell them the story of their grandfather, not hiding from his crimes, but also not reducing him to nothing more than his worst actions. In telling that story, Sarah had learned something important about the nature of truth and justice. The legal system could punish wrongdoing and protect society from dangerous individuals, but it could not address the deeper questions of human worth and the possibility of redemption. Those questions had to be answered by individuals, families, and communities willing to grapple with complexity and ambiguity in their search for healing. The last entry in the official case file was a letter that Sarah had written to Detective Santos, thanking her for the persistence and compassion she had brought to the investigation. In that letter, Sarah reflected that her father's greatest crime had not been the financial fraud that sent him to prison, but his decision to abandon his family by escaping rather than serving his sentence and trying to rebuild their relationships through honest effort and time. But she also wrote that his greatest redemption had come not from evading justice, but from spending his final years in service to others, using his skills and knowledge to help people avoid the financial pitfalls that had destroyed his own family. In the end, she concluded, justice had taken a form that no court could have prescribed and no law could have anticipated. It had emerged from the slow, difficult work of trying to repair damage that could never be fully undone, one family and one person at a time. The Westbrook case remained unique in the annals of American law enforcement, the only verified instance of someone disappearing from a maximum security cell and living to tell about it, even if that telling came decades after the fact. But its true significance lay not in its impossible circumstances, but in its very human story of failure and redemption, of the ways that people could surprise each other with both their capacity for harm and their potential for healing. In the quiet moments when Sarah thought about her father, she chose to remember not the man who had betrayed his family's trust and disappeared into the night, but the man who had spent his final years teaching rural families how to manage their money wisely and avoid the debts that could destroy their futures. Both men were her father. Both were part of the complicated legacy he had left behind. But it was the second man who gave her hope that people could change, that mistakes did not have to define entire lives, and that redemption was always possible for those willing to do the patient work of earning it.